Velvet purple folds around a staff of elder wood. A feathered firebird cries out where a lonely watcher stood. The Hogwarts towers fade like smoke within the grayish mist,
while tarot cards turn over in a hand that fate has kissed. Sequence 9, the Seer's side is not a crown but chains. The fool's path is a spiral through the cosmic bloody stains. Beyond the seven lights and through the castle's hallowed door, we seek the ancient secrets in the heart of Evermore.
A pale mask laughs in silence at the secrets we have kept, while multiple red moons look down on a world that never slept.
The bay under transcends the man, the wizard loses pride.
For divination's power is a dark and dangerous tide.
Humility before the end, humility before the end. The prophecies begin to bend. One turn of card, one twist of bone, the fool ascends the empty throne. Sequence 9, the Seer's side is not a crown but chains. The fool's path is a spiral through the cosmic bloody stains. Beyond the seven lights and through the castle's hallowed door, we seek the ancient secrets in the heart of Evermore. The fog remains. The card is flipped. Behold.
Beneath the spire of stone and glass, where Hogwarts shadows softly pass, I trace the lines of ancient fate. Beyond the veil, the golden gate.
A sequence climbs a fool's design. But sequence climbs a fool's design between the prophecy and the sign. A wand of elder, a deck of gold, a story yet to be controlled. Sequence 8, the clown, the masquerade. In the great fog, the dead is paid. Smiling light as the prophecy ends. Divine the stars, divine the deep. Behind the deep, a secret that the fool must keep.
I pull the strings of marionettes. I place the final heavy bets. The Hogwarts crest, a bird of fire, against the cosmic cold desire.
A jester's smile, a wizard's mask on. A jester's smile, a wizard's mask, to hide the weight of every task. A little knowledge, a lot of pain. Divination is but a chain. Sequence 8, the clown, the masquerade. In the great fog, the dead is paid. Smiling light as the prophecy ends. Divine the stars, divine the deep. Behind the deep, a secret that the fool must keep. Beyond the stars, beyond the fog.
velvet curtain hides the turning gear, a parlor trick to chase the winter fear. Behind the beard, the silver smoke expands, an empty sleeve, a trick of weathered hands. He calls the card, the fool upon the ledge. The world is wide, beyond the jagged edge. The void is laughing through the painted mask, a cosmic answer to a simple task. No magic wand, just shadows from the deep, where ancient secrets and the monsters sleep. I am the magician, I am the fool, breaking every single golden rule. Breaking every single golden rule.
1,000 whispers in the spinning mist, the names of stars that never should exist, a puppet dancing on a silver thread. Beyond the stars, the moons begin to bleed, a puppet dancing on a silver thread.
Turn the page, the cards begin to blur. The master and the ghost are what they were. The void is laughing through the painted mask, a cosmic answer to a simple task. No magic wand, just shadows from the deep, where ancient secrets and the monsters sleep. I am the magician, I am the fool, breaking every single golden rule. Breaking every single golden rule. The fool, the magician, the puppet. The fool, the magician, the puppet. The cards are dealt, the show is done. A fool becomes the sun. Long white hair and beard of snow, ancient eyes that see the flow, ornate robes with celestial lines, weaving through the grand designs. A vibrant avian on the shoulder blade, a vibrant avian on the shoulder blade, fire-kissed and unafraid. In the arched hall where secrets sleep and ancient promises we keep. The fool, behind the mask we play. In the gray mist we find our way. Tarot cards begin to glow. In the tide of destiny's flow. Sequence 6, the faceless dance, caught within the cosmic trance, within the cosmic trance. A small figure hovers on the left, of earthly form and soul bereft. A spectral mask of glowing white, floating in the dead of night. Terra vortex swirling gray, chasing all the light away. Towering castle on the cliff, fate is such a jagged if. Transmutation of the soul, the universe takes its toll. Incantations fill the air, astral echoes everywhere. No more faces, only the mist. By the outer gods we're kissed. The fool, behind the mask we play. In the gray mist we find our way. Tarot cards begin to glow. In the tide of destiny's flow. Sequence 6, the face
calls, the shadow falls, just a mass
of tears. Velvet robes in amethyst and gray, a crooked wand to chase the night away. From Hogwarts peak to the cosmic door, a fool must walk where angels soared before. The deck is dealt in the gray fog's keep, while common wizards lie in shallow sleep. I pull the strings of fate and violet silk, beyond the potion and the wizard's milk.
The marionette dances on the moon to a dark Victorian elder tune. I am the director, the fool, the king of every secret that the stars will sing. From sequence 5 to the astral gates, I weave the puppet from the ancient fates. Fools, Gambit, beyond there's breath, beyond the magic, beyond the death.
The phoenix fire burns upon my arm, a Patronus shield against the eldritch harm. I manipulate the cards and hidden rolls, a Seer of ghost and beyonder souls. The puppet is a guide, a sacred tool, to play the part of the silent fool. Ancient gods are stirring in the deep, while the wizarding world remains asleep. Behold the transformation, the sequence rises, the threads are spinning. The game of the universe is just beginning. We are the players in the cosmic surrender. The marionette dances on the moon to a dark Victorian elder tune. I am the director, the fool, the king of every secret that the stars will sing. From sequence 5 to the astral gates, I weave the puppet from the ancient fates. Fools, Gambit, beyond there's breath, beyond the magic, beyond the death. The theater is dark, the play is done. The fool has won. Fool. The velvet curtain of the gray fog hangs heavy tonight. I shuffled the major arcana by the candle's failing light. From the battlements of the castle I see the 3 pale moons, but the cards speak not of a phoenix, but of beyonder ruins. Sequence 4, the bizarro, a dance of strings and wood. I sought the path of the sorcerer, where the ancient gods once stood. Oh, the fool looks down from the starry throne of the universe, mixing the potion of a wizard with a primordial reality. Bends like a puppet, the destiny lines all fray. In the bizarro magic, the old world fades away. With a wand of elder and a deck of fate, I command the mist paradox of the Potter heart that the cosmos has kissed. The wand of the cosmos has kissed. The theater of shadows is open, the masks are on the floor. I am no longer the headmaster behind the wooden door. My Patronus is now a shadow, my spells are twisted steel, bring the logic of the world to make the bizarro real. Terror whispers in the hallways, the hister begins to groan, as I claim the sequence of the sorcerer and rule the mist alone. etched in the remnants of the seven lights, the legacy of antiquity burns bright. The scholar witnesses the ether flow, where the fool's tarot begins to grow. Fog surrounds the scholar, the path is wide. Destiny and mystery as one collide. Chronomancy guides the hand and eye under the stars of the night sky. Ancient path meet modern spires in the night. Ancient mysteries within the pale moonlight. Ancient truths that the beyonder must know. Ancient echoes in the castle far below. Surrounds the scholar, the path is wide. Destiny and mystery as one collide. Chronomancy guides the hand and eye under the stars of the night sky. The destiny of the scholar is nigh. Remnants, arcane parchment, gone in the ether. The gray fog thickens round the spires of the school. I draw the card, I play the part of the fool. A slender wand of shadow, a silk hat of stars. To mend the world's great wound, I bear the beyonder's scars. From the sorcerer's stone to the potion of the divine, I walk the pathway where the two worlds entwine. Miracles are but a moment, fate is a long-lived thing. Watch the puppet dance on the invisible string. Sequence to the invoker of the light and the light. A fool in a purple robe under a three-moon sky. A fool in a purple robe under a three-moon sky. I don't just grant wishes, I weave the cosmic thread between the things that were and the things that are yet to be said. The house of the lion roars within the tarot's deck. I feel the ancient corruption breathing down my neck. Miracle, 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 fate, fate, fate. Miracles are but a moment, fate is a long-lived thing. Watch the puppet dance on the invisible string. Sequence to the invoker of the light and the light. A fool in a purple robe under a three-moon sky. A fool in a purple robe under a three-moon sky. The puppet breaks its strings. The gray fog speaks in tongues. Ascend from the school into the elder's sign. Is this a spell, or is it a sign of the divine? Miracles are but a moment, fate is a long-lived thing. Watch the puppet dance on the invisible string. Sequence to the invoker of the light and the light. A fool in a purple robe under a three Remain, flipping card sound. Good night, Mr. Fool. The velvet deck is spread upon the stone. The puppet dances on a silver string. I've watched the Hogwarts light from far above. I've felt the Hogwarts lights from far up, a touch of every cosmic thing. Through the gray fog, the ancient voices call. A beyonder must walk the lonely hall. The fool's mask laughs at the sequence of light, a phoenix flame against the outer night. To serve the mysteries, to fold the hand of fate, I stand gatekeeper outside the gate. Oh, the attendant watches as the stars align. In the cards I hold, the prophecy is mine. A crimson bird sits silent on my shoulder. The world grows gray, the history grows older. I turn the pages of a tome long lost. I turn the pages of a tome long lost. I learned the price and then I paid the cost. One deck, one secret left to keep before the ancient gods awake from sleep. The wand is raised. The sequence breaks. A beyonder transformation for the soul's own sake.
A beyonder transformation for the soul's own sake.
Flip the card, spin the wheel, make it real. The fool's mask laughs at the sequence of light, a phoenix flame against the outer night. To serve the mysteries, to fold the hand of fate, I stand gatekeeper outside the gate. Oh, the attendant watches as the stars align. In the cards I hold, the prophecy is mine.
The gray fog lingers.
Sequence 0, the fool. Hogwarts, farewell. The velvet purple folds around a staff of brittle yew. A path of gilded sequins starts a journey long overdue. Between the velvet curtain and the gray fog's heavy breath, he traded stone for feathers, trading life for velvet death.
Oh, the fool looks down from the castle on the hill. Where the tarot cards are scattered and the prophecies are still. With a phoenix on his shoulder and a marionette in hand. He's a sequence 0 waiting
spinning faster through the vortex of the mind. Their cards are spinning faster through the vortex of the mind. A mask of porcelain laughter is the only thing we find. Sequence zero rising, where the stars begin to bleed. From the castle walls of Hogwarts to the Terror's ancient sea.
Oh, the fool looks down from the castle on the hill, where the tarot cards are scattered and the prophecies are still. With a phoenix on his shoulder and a marionette in hand, he's the sequence hero waiting in the cold and ancient land.
The fog remains. The game is done. Wait for the next card. The fool has won.